Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of the Texas Public Policy Foundation's weekly live stream. I'm Kevin Roberts, the Executive Director, and happy to serve as the host of this weekly live stream, especially this week, where we have two really smart analysts of American politics and of conservatism, also a couple of good friends of mine. I can vouch for the next hour of your life being well spent with these two gentlemen. Obviously, we are living in a time this year, 2020, that's been filled with challenges, to say the least, from the advent of the COVID pandemic to the equally bad response of so many governments overreaching their authority, infringing upon our freedoms, to an election that still officially has not yet been concluded, even though one of the candidates, the presumptive president-elect Joe Biden, has begun filling his cabinet. So what we aim to do for you today is to take stock of where we are this day, the last day of November 2020, as well as look ahead to policy opportunities here in Texas at the upcoming legislative session, as well as policy opportunities and challenges at the federal level in Congress. But for those of you who are interested in the future of the conservative movement, beyond 2020, for that matter, beyond 2021, we will touch on that topic as well. So thanks for taking some of your time to join us this week. You're in for a great conversation. Joining me today are my good friends, Matt Mackowiak, who's president of the Potomac Strategy Group. Matt is one of the top-notch political consultants and analysts, conservative thinkers of our era. He's based here in Austin, just up the street, but also has an office in Washington, D.C. Matt, like I, is a long-suffering University of Texas alum because our football team just can't seem to get its act together. Nonetheless, I'm going to sport my burnt orange even after a loss on Friday. For all of you out there looking for Longhorns to suffer, you just need to look at the burnt orange. Also joining us is a non-University of Texas alumnus and alumnus of Franciscan University in Ohio. That is my good friend Terry Schilling, Executive Director of the American Principles Project. I'll let Terry explain all of the good work that they're doing. But to both of you, Terry and Matt, thanks for taking time post-Thanksgiving for this live stream.
Thanks for having us.
You bet. So we'll go with the out-of-state guest first, Terry, and ask you to tell us a little bit about the work that the American Principles Project does before we dive into an analysis of this year's election.
Well, again, thanks so much for having me on today, Kevin. I love the work that TPPF does. There's so much that we agree on and complement each other on. Basically, what we do at American Principles Project is we organize parents and family advocates in politics to help defend and grow the family in America. One of our supporters put it very simply. He said, "Oh, you're kind of like the NRA for families." And that's exactly right. The NRA organizes gun owners in politics to protect the Second Amendment, and we organize parents and families to protect families. We want to make it easier to get married, have babies, and protect our kids through education and sports and all of that good stuff. And so that's been our primary focus over the last few years, and we've had some really great success. And we saw some really interesting stuff happen in this 2020 election with the shift of the Republican Party to being much more pro-family as its priority when it comes not just to the social stuff, but also working class families and giving them the things that they need. It's a very healthy party. And you're seeing that with President Trump getting almost 75 million votes in the 2020 election. That didn't just come out of nowhere. There's something special that he put together with his policy agenda in the White House. And so we want to help continue that momentum, that pro-family agenda that really helped him create it doesn't look so great right now, but it is a winning coalition for future races, that's for sure.
Well, thanks for that observation. I think that's something that we'll really delve into in some detail today. Matt Mackowiak, you're very much in the front lines of some of these races. Your analysis of conservative messaging, but also running point on a handful of key races for the U.S. House. We know that you also do some work here for some Texas legislative races. I'm curious, just sort of 30,000 foot view before we get into the status of the presidential election. What's your sense of what's going on in the minds of the American electorate in 2020?
Yeah, I mean, look, all politics is national. Used to be that all politics is local, but the last 4 years, the national political environment has dominated everything, and I do think that we saw that with this presidential election, but also with the down ballot races. If you look at conservative candidates that succeeded, really swimming upstream in a difficult environment, being outspent significantly with a lot of money coming from outside the state. They all were in a range where they were overperforming the top of the ticket by 4 to 6%. And in a few cases, there were people that did even better than that. I think Susan Collins in Maine being one example of that. But those candidates did a good job of holding the Republican base, but then growing their margin enough that they could get 50% plus one. And I think they did that by establishing their own identity, which I think is really important in politics. You have to have your own identity. You are part of a party, you're part of a movement. You can support your president, your nominee, your national party leader, but you need to have your own identity. You need to have your own issues, your own sort of image, and really you want to have your own character attributes. And so I think when you look at the candidates that ran the best campaigns this election cycle, I would point to someone like Michael McCall, who raised $4 million this election cycle. I think he told me he never raised more than $2 million. He had the first ground game of any congressional candidate in the country. He started knocking doors in February of 2019. They knocked over 225,000 doors, made over, I think, 500,000 phone calls. He had over 100 high school and college kids serving as interns on his campaign. He ran an extraordinary campaign, and despite being outspent by a left-wing candidate, he did very, very well and was reelected. So that model to me is one we have to look at. I think the other model for conservatives, and I wrote about this in a guest column in the San Antonio Express News a couple of weeks ago, is that I worked with Tony Gonzalez in the Will Hurd congressional district where he was successful in congressional district 23, and then I watched John Cornyn's reelection campaign very closely as well. They both, I think, had models that Republicans and certainly conservatives need to study going forward. They both, I think, focused on independent voters, on swing voters. They had messages that were broadly appealing. They ran very, very good, efficient, strong campaigns. And they did what they needed to do to overperform the top of the ticket. You look at Trump winning Texas by 6%, Cornyn won Texas by 10%. Despite, again, being outspent. I think Cornyn had something like $30 million in negative ads run against him the last 3 weeks of the election. And he still won by 10%. Gonzalez won a district that's flipped 4 of the last 5 elections, and he won it by a modern landslide of 4.6% when Will Hurd won by less than 1,000 votes 2 years ago. So I think in both of those candidates, we have to look at those models. They both ran really good campaigns, and they give us things to study for the future.
Well, they do. And I think that more than anything else, at least at the very beginning of today's episode, gentlemen, each of you has offered some hope for our audience. Some folks tuning in are real focused on the presidential race. Others are more focused on sort of the long term, maybe 2022. Many people tune in really interested in the very long term, which is sort of the timeline of ideas, which might take a generation or two. And so I'm grateful that you've set the table well for us. In order to move along in this analysis of what's going on in 2020 and what we think is going to happen in 2022, we need to take stock of where the presidential race is now. I've heard from dozens, if not hundreds, of friends and acquaintances in the last couple of weeks, many over the Thanksgiving holiday, just asking, who can we believe about the state of the race? And so I'm going to turn to you first, Terry Schilling, to just give us a quick assessment of where we are in the presidential race and when you think we will know ultimately and officially and with some sort of certainty what the outcome is.
Thanks, Kevin. So basically, there's still a lot of litigation going on, and we still have to do a lot more digging. I actually just wrote about this topic. I think it's a really big issue that the majority of Republican voters in 2020 believe that there was significant voter fraud across the country that happened. And if we, as a Republican Party, want to continue to win races and not have our base be demoralized, it's important that we leave no stone unturned and we continue to dig into this and make sure that any bit of voter fraud, even if it wasn't enough to overturn the outcome of the election, is uncovered and it's addressed for future races. We're seeing this right now in the runoff races in Georgia. There's a significant. We're spending around. We're gonna spend at least $1 million in Georgia to help out Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue. They're very good on family issues, but what we're seeing in our initial voter contacts is that there's a good portion of Republicans who are demoralized. They think that the election was stolen, and that's a dangerous position to be in with your party when your base thinks that it's stolen, because then they're hopeless and they don't think that there's any winning a race, even if they show up to vote. And so we've got to address the voter fraud claims. We've got to find out everywhere it's happened and how to fix it. I think one of the best guys that we should be consulting with is Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, which went off without a hook. They had early voting, mail-in voting, absentee voting. They had everything, but there was no voter fraud. There was, the results were reported in a timely manner. It was a really great system, and I think it was probably because they've had some foul ups in the past. But we need to have someone like Ron DeSantis come in, help us in the future with how to secure the ballot and ensure some integrity in our ballot systems. But there's still a lot of litigation going on. We have to find out all of this and disclose it and be totally transparent. Otherwise, we're going to have a disaster on our hands in 2022 and in the future.
Sure. And as you indicated, the first sense of that might come in just 35 days from now with those 2 Georgia Senate races. So real important observation there. Matt Mackowiak, you also have written about the state of the race. I'm curious what you're thinking here the last day of November, the state of the presidential election is.
Yeah, so I'd start by pointing out that despite what the Democrats and the media and the left are trying to convince everyone that this was somehow not a close election because the popular vote difference appears to be about 6 million votes, that's really not the way to measure it. I sort of compare it to saying that the team that gains the most yards on offense should win the football game rather than the team that scores the most points. I was looking at something that Howard Feynman posted a little bit ago. He said 44,000 votes changed from Biden to Trump across Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia. We would have had a 269 electoral college tie, right? 3 states, 44,000 votes. If you remember from 4 years ago, it was 3 states and 87,000 votes, or about 80,000 votes across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. So this was a very close election. The president went from 63 million to 74 million votes. I never in my life thought he'd get 4 million votes. I saw a path to 68, 69, maybe 70 million. Did not see one to 74 million. He deserves great credit. I also didn't see a path for Biden going from whatever it was, 66 million to 80 million. Given that the enthusiasm level for Biden has never been very high, and given that Trump was likely to overperform along the margins with Hispanics and African Americans, which he did. So where do things stand? I think it's important that your viewers hear things maybe they don't want to hear, they don't want to believe. And I wish there was a way that I could wave a magic wand and President Trump would be reelected. It's vastly better for the future of the country that happened. I think the odds at this point that the president prevails through the courts in such a way that he gets sworn in for a second term on January 20th are very, very low. Certainly less than 10% and maybe quite a bit lower than that. And the reason for that is it's a little bit like a parlay if you've ever followed sports gaming, right? He can't just win Pennsylvania. He's got to win like 3 states at this point. So you take the odds of overcoming the deficit through the courts in 1 state, and the odds of even doing it in 1 state are fairly low. But to do it in 2 or 3 states and have that happen, I think you'd have to prove election fraud in an admissible way with evidence in the courts. And up to this point, I think they have basically failed to do that. Do I believe that there was election fraud? Yes. The reason they expanded mail ballots was partially that Democrats were concerned that their base was not going to turn out due to fear of COVID. But it was much more that they wanted to take low propensity and unregistered voters and allow them to vote, particularly in urban areas, in areas where they had control of the county clerk offices, et cetera. I think that the effort that the Trump campaign is undertaking is one that is useful. because, very rarely do you see a very significant election integrity project pursued at the national level. Usually you don't have the time, you don't have the focus, you don't have the resources, you don't have the lawyers. And in some ways, I wish the legal effort were more professional than it is. But I think this can be valuable, even if the president doesn't have 2 or 3 states flip and he get sworn in again. I think there is value to demonstrating that there is election fraud. I mean, we know in Texas there's election fraud. We see examples of it, on a monthly basis. The Attorney General's office did an extraordinary job prosecuting that with very limited resources, although I believe they're expanding those resources going forward, and they should expand them even more after legislative session. So we'll see if they can get to signature matching in Georgia, and if they can get the U.S. Supreme Court to rehear the case in Pennsylvania. If I want to see them pursue it, and this thing doesn't become final until the Electoral College meets in state legislative capitals on December 14th, and then until it meets in Washington at the U.S. Capitol on December 18th. That's when this becomes really at a place where it cannot be overturned. But so again, I just wish that the evidence that the Trump team had put together was presented in an easier way for the public and the media to consume and to take in and to consider. It's clear the media has no interest in this whatsoever. It's a see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil kind of approach. But I do think that the media on the right, the Federalist had a very interesting story a few days ago about the statistical anomalies that we've seen in 3 or 4 of these states on election night. You have to understand why the president's frustrated. He went to bed on election night looking very likely that he won. And he wakes up the next morning after states say they're going to stop counting, and it now looks like he's behind. Is that legitimate? Is that illegitimate? It's entirely possible it's legitimate because mail ballots came in that were postmarked by the dates required in the states, and that those mail ballots broke in Biden's favor. It's also entirely possible it was illegitimate, whether that be through Dominion voting systems, whether that be through throwing out legal ballots cast for Trump, other ways. It is possible it's a combination of legitimate and illegitimate. I don't know whether we're ever going to know the answer, and it's a terrible thing that half this country is going to see this result as illegitimate. That is a failure of every county that's involved here, of every state. You pointed to Governor Ron DeSantis. Florida and Ohio, we knew on election night who won. And you know why that is? It's because they allow mail ballots to be counted, not after the polls close on election day, but they're allowed to be counted the day they come in once early voting starts. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, a number of those states don't allow that. We need to move to that system. Every state needs to pass that going forward, but we got to get to a place where people have more confidence in our election systems. And right now, I think it's entirely reasonable for a third or even half the country to look at this and have serious questions about our electoral system. One last point I'd make: Stacey Abrams has said she's collected 950,000 mail ballots in Georgia for the runoffs. So I hope Georgia conservative voters out there, people who are concerned about pro-life and conservative judges and not moving in a left-wing direction, decide that it's worth making the effort to turn out on January 5th, because the stakes in Georgia could not be higher.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we like to say here in Austin, Matt, that as Texas goes, so goes the country. That's true, but at least for the next 6 weeks, it's going to be even more true in Georgia, right? Because if in fact the Democrats are able to win both those seats, the Biden-Harris administration is going to govern not just center left, but very much from the left. And whether it's the issues that the American Principles Project pays attention to, more of the social issues, or the issues that we pay attention to here more at TPPF, economic issues, freedom issues. Obviously, there's very important overlap there as conservatives. We're all going to be very busy, not just with legislation, but also with litigation if both of those seats are claimed by the Democrats. So Matt has touched on some election law reform that needs to happen. Terry, I want to pitch to you on that question because I know that you've been very active in some campaigns at the state level over the last several years, and you may have seen even prior to 2020 some concerns about election fraud, whether that be through ballot harvesting or other means. Before we move on and sort of assess the state of the conservative movement, would there be any additional reforms you would add to Matt's list?
Yes, actually, Kevin, I just wrote about this in the Federalist, where I point out that the Democrats ended up getting a special prosecutor to look into the Russia hacking and collusion issue. from the 2016 election. And I look at, all the claims that they made that really fell through and fell short of being real, and how illegitimate that entire process was. We call in this article for a special counselor to investigate the election fraud of the 2020 elections. I think that you need something big. I think you need something bold. If there really was no election fraud, and we have plenty of stories and plenty of affidavits that have been signed of witnesses who have seen all of this, there really is nothing to be worried about, then what could it hurt to have a special counselor and a prosecutor to investigate all of this? It seems like if it was good enough to investigate the Russians hacking our election system, it's good enough to investigate all of these, hundreds and probably even over 1,000 stories of, ballots being dropped off, by unmarked trucks and vans and the Dominion hacking system, all of that. Let's investigate it. Let's have a special prosecutor that is approved by both sides to look into all of this, have recommendations. One thing that I thought was really underlooked here was James Baker and former President Jimmy Carter had an amazing report on ballot integrity and how to ensure safe and fair elections. And one of the things that they were most concerned about was the mail-in balloting issue. And we did that in 2020 for the first time on a massive scale. And it's no wonder it was a disaster. Even, Democrats like Jimmy Carter are concerned about it. So one, I would say the special prosecutor, and then two, I think we need to go back to that report by Baker and Carter and look at what they're proposing as safeguards to ensure safe and fair elections in this country.
Yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to happen there. Here at TPPF, we've been working on our election protection project for almost all of 2020. We started that work before the advent of COVID, which of course had tremendous impact on the election, especially when it comes to the mail-in balloting. And I'm glad we did, because what we encountered prior to the summer, let's say, was a number of officials, some of them very conservative, who simply either didn't believe that there was that level of fraud that it could change the outcome of elections, or they didn't believe they could do anything about it. And so I think one of there are two values to President Trump pursuing these legal efforts, in spite of the fact that his chances of prevailing are very, very slim. I'd probably peg them at less than 1%, not because I hope that, but I just think that's realistic. The first is the demoralized base, which Terry talks about. And the second is that for those of us from the think tank point of view who are trying to analyze the problems and propose solutions, we need to convince elected officials that this is a problem. And so pursuing this and actually proving some of these cases in courts, even if it's not enough examples to overturn or change the outcome of the election, I think is crucial for the future. So Matt, that's the context for the next question I have for you. In spite of what we know to be some serious election integrity issues in Texas, conservative candidates up and down the ballot did very well. In fact, a lot of us who spend almost 100% of our time analyzing Texas elections were amazed at the president's performance in border counties in Texas. Of course, because of a congressional campaign you worked on, that's something the media doesn't want to cover. What is going on in Texas that, in spite of all of the reasons the media and the left give us to think that the state is changing, that in fact, it was a very successful election for right of center candidates?
Yeah, and I would actually flip it and say it's not just that it was a very successful election for conservative and center right candidates. It was an absolute unmitigated disaster for the left in Texas. They entered this election cycle believing, number one, that they were going to take the majority back in the Texas House. They needed a net of 9 seats to get there. Kevin, I know you were not in Texas, at TPPF back when the Democrats still had control of the Texas House. That went through 2002 until Tom Craddock took over in January 2003. I mean, it's been a long time since we've had divided government. It's hard to even remember what that felt like, how it affected things, but it would have changed things so much. The governor, lieutenant governor, what they want to do, what their goals are, they would have been really at risk in a Democrat-controlled House. You add to that redistricting, which is up in the 2021 session and is going to last for 10 years with new maps. The stakes in Texas could not have been higher. So the Democrats entered this cycle believing, number one, they were going to take the Texas House back. And they looked at the previous 2 cycles and had reason to believe that was possible. They looked at 2018 and they saw Ted Cruz at the top of the ticket won by 2.6% over Beto O'Rourke. But with that margin, they took 12 seats back in the Texas House. 2 years before that, when Donald Trump won Texas by 9%, they won a net of 5 seats in the Texas House. That's 17 seats in 2 cycles. So that's right on the average of not the 9 that they thought they needed, that they knew they needed. So they were very focused on that. And you had candidates running for state house in some of these seats, even these targeted races, have no connection to the district. One of them, I won't even get into it, but there are so many candidates there that they're just not connected to their district, not impressive, not professionally connected, not philanthropically connected. They're really just kind of, zombie candidates almost, who were raising literally hundreds of thousands, and in some cases, millions of dollars, most of it from outside the state in some of these targeted state house races. So the threat for taking the Texas House back was huge. Not only did the Democrats not take the House back, they didn't even yet net 1 new seat. So that 9-seat majority the Republicans had going in is the exact same number they have in the next legislature. I mean, I don't know any Republican. I really don't think I know any Republican operative who thought that was possible. I think most of us were expecting maybe at best a handful of seats that would go to the Democrats. So that's a huge issue because it has ramifications for the next 10 years and the upcoming legislative session, obviously. Then you look at the congressional districts, right? The Democrats were targeting 8, 9, maybe 10 seats, and the map was expanding the closer we got to the election. They only had 2 seats where they were playing defense, and they did win. They did hold those seats. But if you look at the other seats, the other 6, 7, 8 seats, whatever you want to call it, they didn't win one of those seats either. So they were zero. They were zeroed out basically when it came to the congressional seats and when it came to the state house seats. Why did that happen? It happened. It goes back to what I was saying before about our best candidates having their own identity, running good campaigns, having a message, and overperforming the top of the ticket. You saw this in Dallas with folks like Jeff Leach and Matt Shaheen and so many others. You saw this in Houston. You saw this in South Texas. You mentioned Trump. I mean, it's amazing. Based on exit polling, it appears Trump got a larger share of the non-white vote than any Republican candidate since 1960. I kind of feel like I should just pause for a second while we all think about that, right? That is amazing. And while there may have been some fears that Trump was going to continue to grow his share of the white vote while shrinking his share of the non-white vote, and that could demographically create long-term problems for the Republican Party, that's not in evidence. Those facts are simply not in evidence. And so in South Texas, you look at Zapata County, you look at Starr County. These are counties that Clinton won by 20, 25, 30%. Trump won both those counties. And that benefited Republican candidates down ballot, including Tony Gonzalez, who was successful in that congressional race in District 23. So what does this tell us? I actually think Karl Rove's column in the Wall Street Journal 2 weeks ago is very much worth reading because there are a couple of things that happened here that explain why this happened. Number one, Republicans spent 2 years registering voters in an unprecedented way, with money, with time, with resources, with personnel. And they registered a net of 150,000 more voters since the 2018 election than the Democrats did. That's probably never happened in my lifetime. It's certainly not happened in the last 20 years. Battleground Texas has been very focused on net registering Democratic voters. So we had a net gain of registered Republicans. That's number one. Number two, the Republican team was unified and they did enormous amounts of voter contact. So while the Democrats were saying we can't go door to door because of COVID, Republicans were saying, no, we can wear a mask. We can stand 6 feet from the door. We can hand you a handout, and we're going to make those door-to-door contacts. And I can tell you in congressional, District 23, it was, unbelievable the difference. I think we knocked on something like 50 or 60,000 doors in the last 6 weeks compared to 0 on the Democratic side. So it makes a huge difference that we were able to have that ground game and they weren't. But look, we had good candidates. They ran good campaigns. They were able to talk about property tax reform as a major accomplishment from the legislative session at the state level. And at the congressional level, the left-wing agenda, which may work in California and New York, does not work in Texas, right? Green New Deal, Medicare for all, defunding the police, socialism. These ideas are not popular in Texas. They are 15, 20, 25% issues. And our candidates did a great job hammering those issues in a way that helped them with contrast.
Well, and the result of that, of the success in Texas for Republican candidates, at least for the U.S. House, is that Republicans will gain 13 seats there. And Terry, that's going to have a dramatic impact on the agenda that the Speaker of the House in D.C. has. And I'm just curious if you would look into your crystal ball for our audience about what you think the policy priorities will be in D.C. as a result of the apparent Biden win.
Mhm.
We're going to assume that somehow the Republicans keep control of the Senate, and Democrats, we know, will now have a single-digit majority in the House. What does the policy agenda look like with that kind of divided government?
Yeah, Kevin, I can get into that real quick, though. I'd like to just mention something about one of the Texas races that we got involved in. Just to reiterate Matt's point, Chip Roy was someone that we invested heavily in, and it was because Chip is the type of member of Congress that you can't buy off. He is who he is. He's always going to be who he is. He's willing to work hard. And if you look at the election results in his district, he was outspent 2-1. And we're not talking like $1 million to $2 million. He was outspent $4.5 million to $8.7 million by Wendy Davis. I mean, this is ridiculous, and it's because he won because his message resonated with voters, and voters trust guys like him. Chip Roy is the model for taking back the House. It's the model for growing our gains in the Senate and getting the White House back. So I just want to really reiterate that point, because he was someone that worked really hard, made the right calls, listened to his voters, and was rewarded for that. Nationally, I think the most likely thing, with the Democrats having such a slim majority in the House, and Republicans probably most likely controlling the Senate, there's not going to be a lot of legislation passed. What you're looking at getting passed through Congress is most likely COVID relief, and hopefully that includes some relief from small business for small businesses. One of the conservative leaders that I've met through my travails in Texas is Tim Dunn, and he put it the best way I could have ever heard it, which is, with this COVID stuff, you have like 35% of small businesses that have closed and are most likely never going to open. And it's all because the government broke it. They broke our economy. They didn't respond well to the pandemic. And now all these small businesses are going out. The government has to pay for it. They've got to pay. If you're going to shut down these small businesses, you've got to pay for it. And hopefully that's one of the packages that Democrats and Republicans can figure out how to work together on. Pelosi play a lot of games, but I think the most likely outcome that we're going to see is a blitzkrieg from the administrative state, from progressives there. Kevin, it was actually about 3 years ago today, around this time, that TPPF and APP hosted a joint conference on the administrative state and how to deal with it at your headquarters in Austin. And we outlined there just how dangerous and how big the administrative state has gotten. Trump used it to our benefit, but you got to be kidding yourself if you don't think that Biden's going to be using it to their benefit. What you're going to see is the Democrats are going to focus on climate change reform. They're going to focus on, they're going to use the administrative state to do all their foreign policy garbage and interfere in all the world's problems. And they're most likely going to try and implement the Equality Act, the LGBT non-discrimination laws through the administrative state, like the Department of Education. So just to give you an example, what that looks like is, under the Obama administration, they used the Department of Education to deny Title IX funding to schools who didn't allow boys who identify as girls to use the girls' restrooms. So they would basically block the funding for these schools and basically shut them down. Trump reversed that policy, and he actually went the right way on it. And he said, any schools that allow boys to compete in girls' athletics are at risk of losing their Title IX funding. So he actually used Title IX for its original purpose, which is to protect girls' opportunities in sports and education. What you're going to see with the Biden administration, I almost said the Biden administration, because Biden is just hiring all of the Obama staff that Obama had in his White House. What you're going to see, though, under the Biden administration is they are going to weaponize Title IX to do the exact opposite. They're going to say, you're at risk of losing Title IX funding if you don't allow these boys who identify as girls to compete in girls' athletics. So they're going to really weigh in on these culture wars. They're going to destroy the economy even further through the administrative state. I wouldn't be surprised if they use the administrative state to start enforcing some of these COVID guidelines from the CDC or what have you. it's going to get real bad, and they're going to attack from all angles, just like they always do. And I call it a progressive blitzkrieg, because that's what they're planning to do.
That's exactly what's going to happen. I mean, you don't need to hear it from me, but TPPF has been advising the administration for a few years now on policy areas we work on. Some of them you've mentioned. And it's clear to me that the most negative consequence of President Trump apparently losing this election of many is that the administrative state will be able to start regrowing with no check whatsoever.
Mhm.
In fact, the president would probably need 4 terms just to completely deal the death blow to the administrative state, which is, make no mistake, the greatest threat to our liberty as human beings on the planet. There is no greater threat than the American administrative state. And to call it pejoratively the deep state is entirely correct. And I think that those of you in the audience who see a connection between some of those folks in the administrative state and some of the apparent silliness we've seen with election laws are not dealing in conspiracy. You're dealing with something that's legitimate there. We have to do our jobs to figure out what those links are. And so I'm grateful that you at least set the table well on that issue, as challenging as it's going to be, Terry. So Terry and Matt, we have the best audience around, and they've already started asking questions. If you're in the audience and you have a question you want to pose, just go into the comments box of the social media channel you're on. But gentlemen, we're going to turn to the first question, which, not surprisingly, given what's on everyone's minds, is about election protection. And this audience member asks, why vote if your vote doesn't matter? In today's hearing in Arizona, someone said your vote is less secure than your Venmo account. How would you respond to that, Matt?
Yeah, look, I understand the frustration. I really do. What I would say is that, number one, we don't know how much, cheating is going on, and so you can never know how much your vote matters as it relates to all the cheating that is going on, right? And so by not voting, you make the cheating easier, I would argue, right? Because you're taking away, you're sort of choosing to take away a legal vote. But look, I understand the frustration. I do. And look, I deal with this in Travis County where we are. We sued the county over preventing poll watchers and clerks from carrying out their duties. And the threat of that litigation led us to getting a very good outcome that I think is going to protect election integrity. We've sent criminal referrals to the Secretary of State's office. We've done everything we can think to do. All I can say is, look, you look at, there are races across the country. There's a congressional race in Iowa that a Republican woman just won by 6 votes. There's an election race in New York that a Republican woman incumbent won by 22 votes. Our Republican nominee in House District 47, a courageous police officer named Justin Berry, got in the runoff by 1 vote. Your vote matters. Am I going to argue that your 1 vote as one person makes a huge difference in a presidential election? No. Although we do remember in Florida in 2000 that George W. Bush won Florida by 537 votes. It's a pretty small number. It's a rounding error. It's not even a rounding error. It's a rounding error on a rounding error, basically. But in a local race, I do believe your vote matters. Absolutely. And I actually think the reason you should vote is it's your civic responsibility to be an engaged citizen. And you're going to be more likely to be engaged if you vote. I know I feel that way. Even if you want to, basically vote straight ticket, whether you do that with one click of a button or you do it on each individual race, there are going to be nonpartisan races. There are going to be propositions. You're going to want to know who the judicial candidates are, depending on where you live. And so it forces you to do that homework and to do that research in a way you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it the same way if you weren't taking that responsibility seriously.
Yeah, it's one of the best responses to a very good question that I've heard, Matt. And what I might add to it is, having fought the academic left for 20 years inside humanities faculties at state universities, that I can tell you one of the aims of the radical left is, in fact, to get us who are right of center to disengage, to be silent in a classroom because we're fearful of the repercussions on our grades when we're students, to be quiet during a tenure review so that we're not as conservative publicly as we are privately. And also, we know that there's fraud going on. One of the aims is, in fact, to demoralize the conservative base. And so you need to do the exact opposite thing to fight on that. And hopefully there are enough organizations like the two represented and great professionals like Matt giving you hope that we are going to go fight this. I can tell you that there is no doubt in my mind that President Trump, even if he is not reelected, is going to remain very involved in fighting this, not just for his sake, but far more importantly, for the sake of the country. It's real important to be engaged. Terry, that leads to an excellent follow-up question by another audience member, and it's about the Georgia races. I'm going to pitch to you on this because you're doing some work there. And this audience member asks, how can we be assured that the Senate runoff races in Georgia are going to be fair and not rigged?
Well, I think that the reason that it's going to be fair and not rigged is because the spotlight is on Georgia. And I can tell you that with the activists that we're working with down there, they are all fired up and ready to go. They're organizing, they're getting much better organized. They're going to have a lot more election judges and poll watchers at all of the troubled precincts and polling locations. And that's the number one most important thing to combat fraud. Now, going back to, about whether or not your vote actually matters, what I would say is that you can't get demoralized, obviously. But your vote is the only thing that matters. And what it matters is it matters with your county clerk, it matters with your state representative, it matters with your state senator, and it matters with your governor. So what's everyone doing to demand integrity of our elections from those people? All of these troubled locations, Wayne County, Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Philadelphia, all of that. It's because they have corrupt local officials. And so what we need to be doing is working at the levels and organizing at the levels in which we can force these types of changes and reforms to protect from fraud in the future. America is a very funny thing. It's a very funny country in how we were founded. Our founders set it up to where the people are the ones who have the power and the control. It's not the government. I mean, yes, we give some power to the government, very limited, but the Constitution without the backing and the will of the American people is just a piece of paper. And we saw this with the COVID shutdown, right? I mean, we had to have the Supreme Court, and granted, there were some really great activists and pastors in California, and really probably in Texas as well, and in all the other states, who rebelled against these shutdowns where we're shutting down churches, but we're not shutting down casinos. We're shutting down churches and schools, but we're not shutting down liquor stores or Home Depot or anything else. This isn't constitutional, but they got away with it until the Supreme Court ruled on it. And now, granted, there were some courageous pastors who asserted their constitutional rights, but they came under fire. They came under hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines and were penalized greatly for it. And now they're going to start to get some relief for fighting it. But America is all about what we do as a people and how we organize and how we fight back. Look at the left, use them as an example for how, don't use them as an example for how to respond, but for when to respond, right? Because the left, when they see an injustice, like, the shooting in Minnesota, for example, they all ran out to the streets and started burning our cities down. Well, that's not the right way to respond. So you see voter fraud, you see an election that you think is stolen. Why aren't we burning the phone lines down of our state representatives? Why aren't we burning the phone lines down of our county clerks, of our governors? Demand an integrity process. Demand that they protect our votes. Because I'm telling you that sentiment about my vote not mattering, it's so dangerous, because that's when you start to become a banana republic and it becomes clear that the elections are rigged. And let's be very clear about where America stands. And this is an important thing. You look at America's cultural institutions, academia. Kevin, you've been fighting this for years. You look at academia, Hollywood, the news media, you name corporate America even is now against us culturally. And even on the economic stuff, you look at all of these big guys and these cultural institutions, they're all with the progressives. They've all abandoned Americanism and the American ideals that were set forth in this nation. Our only outlet is elections. So if we give up on the elections, which is really the only area where normal everyday people can make a difference and fight back against academia, fight back against the cultural rot in all of our other institutions, then we're lost. And so we can't give up on it. We have to double down. And I've heard it said, Republicans always have to win by 5% in order to win, an election just to overcome the fraud. And that's there's some truth to that. But if this is how they're going to play, we've got to demand the transparency, integrity, and we've got to double down even more and start winning these races by 10 points. This is the future of our country. It's where we're going to either live or die. And either America is going to stay America or it's going to become China. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't want anything to do with the CCP. I don't want anything to do with China. We don't need a centralized state here. We need the people fighting back and getting fired up. So if you think the election was stolen like I do, burn down the phone lines. Contact your representatives, contact your county clerks, get involved in the local races. I mean, I felt really guilty. I missed a few local races in the past 4 years. That's pathetic. There's no excuse for it. These county boards, these county commissions, these school boards, those matter. And we need to get more involved and organized and engaged at that level.
Yeah, that's well said. And I would say that, and this comes from a legislator friend here in Texas who's a real expert on election law here and elsewhere, who said the single best thing that a concerned citizen can do is serve as an election judge. And you're seeing, y'all know that from your experience, we are seeing that with resounding truth that you think about the cases in Philadelphia, a couple of them in Wisconsin, almost every one of the states that's in question. Often those initial pieces of litigation, those initial lawsuits were about the ability of an election judge to remain present in a room. And I think of someone who's a friend of TPPF, often an audience member of this live stream, who served along with his wife as an election judge in a nearby county. They said after doing that for the 2 weeks or 3 weeks of early voting in Texas, they saw one incident that was somewhat circumspect. And they reported it, and it got handled. As it turns out, it was not a case of election fraud. But the point is that we could rest assured that between the very good election machine system in that county and having election judges there wall to wall, there was no election fraud there. But there are 253 other counties in Texas, and that's not true in all of those cases. So that's something that each of us can do, especially as we gear up for the election in Georgia. So let's pivot from these good questions about election laws and look ahead. And I'm curious, Matt Mackowiak, given the work that you do, if you had to make a forecast about 2022 and 2024 based on what we think we know about 2020, what would that be?
Well, we know historically that the party that's not in the White House, almost every election in the last 100 years has lost seats in their first midterm. The only exception to that being the Republicans after 9/11 when they gained seats. So if you presume that Biden is going to be president and that Republicans likely hold the Senate by holding at least one of the 2 Senate seats in the runoff on January 5th, that would mean Republicans are likely to gain seats. I do think there's a great opportunity for Republicans to take the House back. If they net 13 seats, and I think they needed 19, if my math's correct, I think they're 6 short. That's very much in a range where they can do this. Redistricting is going to help the Republicans as well. Number of blue states are losing seats, number of red states are gaining seats. So, the stakes for the midterms are going to be very high. And I think to Mr. Schilling's point earlier, Pelosi's in a very difficult position. I mean, it's almost one of those situations where I almost wonder if she really wants to be speaker for 2 more years, because she's going to have an 8 or 10 seat majority. She's going to have to try to mollify her problem solvers caucus, but also keep her progressive base. She's going to lose some motions to recommit, some procedural votes on the floor if Republicans are smart in how they offer them. And she's not going to be able to do nearly anything close to what she's done the last 2 years. And if you look at it, she's gotten really almost nothing signed into law over the last 2 years. They did a lot of messaging bills. And if you look at the results in the election, winning seats back in California and all over the country, electing more women than we've had in a long time, the narrowest Democratic majority in the House since World War II. That's a reflection of what she's done over the last 2 years. And she's now going to be in an even tighter position as long as McConnell remains Senate Majority Leader. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity for Republicans 2 years from now. We definitely over the next 2 years have to address these election integrity issues. Presumably COVID will be behind us. So using expanded mail ballots and unsolicited mail ballots should not be in place. But the midterms are going to be very important. And then after the midterms are over, you'll be back in the next presidential cycle.
Terry, what about you?
Kevin, I'm going to take this from, more of a 20,000 foot view of the Republican Party. And I think Matt just gave a great rundown for the mechanics of it all and what the election is going to look like. I think that from a big picture standpoint, the Republican Party and the conservative movement is going to become much more comfortable using the political power that the American people have entrusted them with when they win elections, right? J.D. Vance said this. He said this at a speech about his Hillbilly Elegy book. He said that, if the Republican Party wants to win, they have to get more comfortable using the political power that the people are giving them. And what we've seen, the big transformation that Trump gave the Republican Party is exactly that. I think that part of the disappointment with the Republican Party is that they're not as aggressive. They'll often punt when they should be going for it on fourth down. So hell, sometimes they even punt on third down. And so I think that overall, you're going to see a Republican Party who's much more likely to try and score and win the game rather than lose and just give it because that's how it's always been done. And I think the Democrats are partly to thank in that because the Democrats have exposed themselves as the win at all costs party and movement that they really are. They've never been crazier if we're being just blunt. But I think that what the Republican Party and the conservative movement looks like in the future is much more family centered. And what I mean by that is not just like social issues. What I mean is that the conservative movement is going to be much more focused on how do we strengthen working families? How do we make sure that working families, don't have to worry about their state or their federal government spending too much money to where they're going to have to raise their taxes down the road? How do we make sure that working families have the flexibility to open up that small business that they always wanted to? How do we ensure that, working families have kids in good schools that are, they're not teaching 1619 and telling our kids that America's evil? That's what the conservative movement looks like. It's a much more American version of the conservative movement. Instead of, I was talking about this before the call with one of my colleagues, John Schweppe, and he pointed out that so often conservatism has been such a bad name. Because if you think about the root of what conserve means, it means to not go further, to conserve the status quo. And that's not what our founders were. Our founders were not conservatives. They were revolutionaries, and they saw major problems. And I think that that's what the future of the right looks like. It's a movement that sees the big problems that Americans are facing and addresses them. And so I think that the better term is Americanism. We'll have a hard time branding that, but I think the future of the party and the movement is one much more likely to take action and use the political power that we're given, and to use that to strengthen families, strengthen the working class, strengthen small businesses, and stop giving everything away to Google and Facebook and all of these big guys like the Republican Party has unfortunately focused on over the past several decades.
Yeah, the problems, and I would say the tentativeness, even the lack of courage by some right of center folks when it comes to big tech is alarming. That's a topic for another day because we're just about out of time. But gentlemen, you've done a great job, I may say, of answering with great thoroughness some excellent questions from our audience. And for our audience members, just want to thank you for those great questions as usual. I want to ask you the last question, which is customary for this live stream, and that is, in this really challenging year, with some challenging months, maybe even years ahead, what optimism, what ideas of hopefulness can you leave our audience with? Matt, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I guess I'd say two things, maybe three things. One is that Operation Warp Speed is probably the single most impressive accomplishment for the United States in 50 years. Maybe since the landing at D-Day. You'd have to really think about at what level that accomplishment is at. The fastest time period for a global pandemic to have a vaccine in human history is 5 years. And this is going to be right at around 1 year, maybe just under 1 year. That's not, President Trump deserves a lot of credit for that. There's no question. It's also the innovation and the research being committed by the pharmaceutical companies. It's government, basically pulling back as much red tape as possible. There's just been so much tremendous focus. And if you think about the, tens, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of lives that'll be saved because of that timeline, it's a wonderful thing we should all celebrate. And I would encourage everyone, unless you have a religious reason not to do it, to very, very strongly consider opting in and taking the vaccine as soon as possible. So that would be number one. Number two would be that, this election showed us that Republicans and conservatives have a winning message. And even more to the point, it showed us that Democrats and liberals have a losing message. And they're not going to change. They're not going to move back to the middle. This is not the sort of DLC, Bill Clinton, early 90s Democratic Party model. They're going to stay way out on the left and keep pushing for crazy things. And so we really just have to make sure we have an agenda that works for people. And there are a lot of good and bad things that have come from the Trump era, far more good than bad. And we're going to need some time to look back on it and to analyze it. But one of the good things is that President Trump has made the Republican Party the party of the working class. And honestly, pretty much every Republican president or presidential candidate in my lifetime, with the possible exception of Ronald Reagan, hasn't done that. But Trump has done that. And he's done that with issues like trade and immigration. He's done that with the way he focuses on various issues, on middle-class tax cuts and other things, on regulation, on small business. We have to keep that going. And so I do think a big part of the conservative movement going forward is we need to analyze what worked and what didn't from the Trump era. I think a lot of what didn't work might have been, very unique things to him and his personality and the way he communicates, the way he behaves. But a lot of the positive things, we need to model them and continue them and look to the future. And I think there are very bright leaders in the conservative movement, whether they be Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, so many others, Tom Cotton, Nikki Haley. There's so many out there, I think, that understand this at their core and who want to move in that direction. So there's a lot to be hopeful about. I just lastly would say we're living at the greatest time for human prosperity in human history. And we should all feel grateful for that.
Yeah, well said. Thanks a lot, Matt. Terry, what about you?
I will say that there are 74 million reasons to be hopeful in the future of this country. And now 74 million are the 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump. And the reason that number is important, it's not because we lost, it's because 74 million Americans voted for the right guy. In the face of the mainstream media literally every day for the past 5 years, not just 4 years when he got elected, but the last 5 years, calling Trump a racist, calling him a Nazi, calling him a whatever-a-phobe. All of that stuff, it didn't matter to those 74 million Americans. Now, we have a lot of work to do because there's 80 million reasons to be less hopeful on the other side. But 74 million is the largest vote share that any Republican candidate has ever gotten in the history of the United States. And it's a lot to build off of. And so what we have to do is make sure, like what Matt was saying, we have a deep bench. We have amazing candidates right now. You might have mentioned this, I think you might have left her out. Kristi Noem. She's someone that has bucked the whole COVID-19 regulations and systems, and her economy's doing great. There's not a huge bunch of deaths from COVID in her state because of this. We have a deep bench of leaders who are willing and ready to step up. Josh Hawley is one of my favorites. Tom Cotton is amazing. Even Kelly Loeffler. I want to point out this. So we had been working forever to get a Save Women's Sports bill to go against all this transgender nonsense that's going on in across the country. Kelly Loeffler, the senator from Georgia, championed that bill, introduced it just 2 months ago, and used it in her campaign to help win that race. So there's a lot to be hopeful for. The Republican Party, the conservative movement is changing, and we got 74 million to build off of. And it's important that we get the right candidate who can motivate those people and then get them even as a bigger coalition than we had before.
Well, to Terry Schilling and Matt Mackowiak, job well done. Thanks so much for your thoughtfulness. By the way, outside this live stream, for your leadership, the excellent work you do professionally, and the lives you lead personally. You're models for the future of America. Here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we wake up optimistic each day because we have the privilege of waking up in Texas. But for those of you who don't, you still have the privilege of waking up in America, which ought to make you optimistic. This country, the ideals that conservatives conserve are always bigger than our own individual lives. They're more transcendent than a particular generation, for that matter. They're more transcendent than even America and Texas themselves. For that reason, that we get to cultivate them, that we have inherited them, we ought to be grateful. And obviously the concerns that all of us share about election integrity are concerns that are deep. They're challenges to the future of America, and we must work on them. We have to fix them. But we also know that our lives, the ideals we fight for, are bigger than any individual election. And whenever the dust settles from this election, whatever that outcome may be, however unlikely it seems that your candidate may have won, tomorrow, we're still going to wake up in America, and some of us in Texas. And both of those ideals, more than places, are worthy of our greatest sacrifice, of our greatest effort. So I'm hopeful that this hour and the wonderful conversation with our guests have left you a little more buoyed, a little more optimistic about the future, because we know, at least here, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I know I can speak for Terry, the American Principles Project, and for my good friend Matt Mackowiak, we're going to keep fighting, and we hope that you were there with us, shoulder to shoulder. Gentlemen, God bless you. For those of you in the audience, may he prosper the work of your hands, and may he continue to bless this great country. Take care.